To go over the first lesson in learning how to animate. So the very first thing we're going to do is open up Photoshop, and we are going to make sure that we have all of the right settings, and we're going to go, I'm going to take you through how to get a dot to move from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen. So the very first thing after we open Photoshop is we're going to hit New File or Command N, and so to make a new document. Now, I already have all of my presets set for animation. However, uh, you need to make sure yours are always the right ones every time you open, because sometimes Photoshop can be weird and not save the settings that you put in um, every single time. So the very first thing we're going to do with this new window is change the title. So I'm going to change it to dot crossing. And I'm going to make sure that this is in, I change it from whatever default it is to pixels. Now the width is going to be 1920 and the height is going to be 1080, and that is the high definition resolution. Now the resolution is 400. We are always going to be working at a 300 resolution. RGB color, 8-bit, background white. This color profile and square pixels. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create. And so I have a lot of stuff already set up, and so I'm going to turn everything off real quick so I can guide you through it. So the very first thing I am going to do is unlock the background. So to set up this area so that it can be an animation, I'm going to go to Window and click on Timeline. This is going to create the timeline down here. I know my screen's, I have to adjust Photoshop because I had just pulled this from the projector, and so it tends to make my Photoshop a little bit longer and a little bit wider. So excuse me while I fix this. So the next thing we are going to do is create video timeline. Now what you're going to see here is this purple layer here, and that is a background layer. This layer does not move. Whatever you draw in here is going to be what stays there in the background the whole entire time. So if you try to animate on this, you're going to get nothing. You can't move between frames. There are no frames to move between. So make sure you do not animate on this layer. So down here we have a scale, and if you go between small mountain and big mountain, it just shows you basically a smaller view or scaled down view of the timeline clip here. And if you zoom in all the way, you can see each individual frame marked off. I like to be somewhere in between here. And so the next thing we're going to do is go to Layer and go to Video Layers, New Blank Video Layers. And so this will create a video layer. You can tell it's a video layer by this video film here in the corner. Now, there are a couple things. First, you want to make sure your loop playback is clicked on. And when you click it, the menu is going to go away. So you're going to click it, make sure it's on, and you're going to make sure Enable Timeline Shortcut Keys is on. That way you can toggle between frames using your arrow keys. It's kind of hard to tell that I'm doing that right now other than following the tracker here. But you'll see how useful that is when we start animating. So another thing we want to do is set timeline frame rate. Now, most of the time we are going to be working at the 8 frames per second. The standard frame rate, or the default frame rate, is going to be 29.97, or otherwise about 30 frames per second. And that's way too fast. That's way too much work for 1 second. And the lowest preset they have is 10, so we are going to enter a custom one and make sure it's 8. When you click OK, you're going to notice that this jumps down a lot in terms of length. It is still the same amount of time, which is 5 seconds, but because there is only 8 frames per second rather than 29.97 frames per second, you can see how many less frames there are. So if you want to change the length of each layer, you can play with it kind of like this and just drag. You can also do this with the base layer, and the further you extend it out, the further, in some cases, right now for this layer is stuck at that length. It can go no further than 5 seconds. But if I want it to go further than 5 seconds, I would have to add another video layer. And what I would do is just move it so that the second layer starts where the first layer ends. Now, for this project, we are not going to need that second layer. We're not going to surpass 5 seconds, so don't worry about that. Another thing that you want to know is that this is a tracker, and it tracks what frame you are on. These two things here indicate the workspace. So whatever is in between the workspaces, when you go to playback, that's the tracker stays between those 2 points. If you try to drag the tracker outside, it will go back automatically and play between those 2 points when you want to play back. It's also really helpful to know that when you want to export this later, or in other words, render, you are going to move the end of the workspace to the last frame that you have stuff drawn on. And that way, when you render, it just renders what's within the workspace, so you have no extra white space at the end. So I'm going to make sure my tracker is all the way at the beginning. That way I can start animating on the very first frame. So I have my loop playback on, I have my timeline short keys on, I have auto grouping, I changed my timeline frame rate. And now I get to the fun part. So I'm going to drag this down a little bit so you can see a little bit more of my workspace. And I'm going to make sure that this layer here, I'm going to rename it dot, because that's where I'm animating. And I am going to start drawing. So what I'm going to do is select the brush tool, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so that you can really see what I'm doing. So very first, I am going to start mostly off screen, and I'm going to click. Now, you're not going to be able to see this, but I will walk you through this, and you're next going to press the right arrow key, and that will move you to the next frame. And so I'm going to move my mouse a little bit more and click. So if I go back, this is the first frame, this is the second frame. And I can kind of see where it's going. Now I'm going to move on to the third frame, and so I just I just pressed the right arrow again, sorry. And I'm going to press again. So the trick is, in this case, when you're trying to get the dot to move from one side of the screen to the other, is that you are going to leave the mouse where it is, so you can remember where the dot was last on the screen. And so when you switch it to the next layer, like I'm about to, or next layer, it's not the next layer, the next frame, like I'm about to do now, you can move it a little bit at a time without losing your place. And you can keep going as you can see. Next frame, click, next frame, click, next frame, click, next frame, click. So the closer you get it, the smoother it's going to be. So if you move a little bit at a time versus, you know, moving the dot further, the faster the dot's going to appear to move. Let me finish this. Okay. And so I'm going to move my workspace to this last frame right here so that I don't have any of this white space going on. And I'm going to press space button to play back. You can also press the play button here, and you can see how the dot moves across the screen. Now, when you start animating, you want to make sure that you do not change the frame rate while you have stuff drawn. You want to make sure you always change it before, because if you change it after, so let's make it 9 frames per second. See how it stretches out here, but that means it also adds frames. So there's going to be a lot of skipping, and there's going to be a lot of mess, and it's really hard to clean this up, and it's really hard to add frames in between. So that's why it's very important for you to set the frame rate beforehand. So I just undid that change that I just made. You will also see frame rate. It's also called FPS, or frames per second. And most animations are between 8 and 15 frames per second. High budget animations sometimes go up to 20 frames a second. The more frames you have per second, the smoother it's going to be. Now, when you do your homework assignment, which is the Miyazaki reflection, you're going to find out that Miyazaki animates at 8 frames per second all throughout. And because he has such a low frame rate, he is able to animate mostly in-house, which is largely unheard of because it's super expensive. It takes a long time to animate and get finished polished animations out the door. For an average TV show that's between 15 and 30 minutes, it takes 9 months from pre-production to post-production, which includes animating, storyboarding, editing, all of that stuff. Takes 9 months per episode. So when you hear Miyazaki animating at 8 frames per second, it's kind of unheard of because he has such fluid animations. So I told you that I would show you what would happen if you animate the dot a little bit further. And I will have this one kind of go around the screen just for fun. So frame rate is incredibly important because it also sets the pace, and it also sets the amount of work that you have to do. So if you have 8 frames per second and you need to animate for 10 seconds, that's 80 drawings. Now, if you have 15 frames per second and you need 10 seconds in your animation, that's a lot more drawings. So you need to be a lot more conscientious of the amount of drawings that you have to do. So you can see that the animation where I put them closer together, it's a lot smoother, but it's also a lot slower. Whereas the animation where I have it kind of going around in circles, but I left more of a gap in between, that is much faster. But it's also not quite as smooth, and you can't really tell because it's moving pretty fast. So, this is about it. This concludes this part of the lesson.